Chapter 13. The ancient overloaded Hudson creaked and grunted to the highway at Sallisaw and turned west, and the sun was blinding. But on the concrete road, Al built up his speed, because the flattened springs were not in danger anymore. From Sallisaw to Gore is 21 miles, and the Hudson was doing 35 miles an hour. From Gore to Warner, 13 miles. Warner to Checotah, 14 miles. Checotah, a long jump to Henrietta, 34 miles, but a real town at the end of it. Henrietta to Castle, 19 miles, and the sun was overhead, and the red fields, heated by the high sun, vibrated in the air. Al, at the wheel, his face purposeful, his whole body listening to the car, his restless eyes jumping from the road to the instrument panel. Al was one with his engine, every nerve listening for weaknesses, for the thumps or the squeals, hums and chattering that indicate a change that may cause a breakdown. He had become the soul of the car. Grandma, beside him on the seat, half slept and whimpered in her sleep, opened her eyes to peer ahead, and then dozed again. And Ma sat beside Grandma, one elbow out the window, and the skin reddening under the fierce sun. Ma looked ahead too, but her eyes were flat and did not see the road or the fields, the gas stations, the little eating sheds. She did not glance at them as the Hudson went by. Al shifted himself on the broken seat and changed its grip on the steering wheel, and he sighed. Makes a racket, but I think she's all right. God knows what she'll do if we got to climb a hill with the load we got. Got any hills between here and California, Ma? Ma turned her head slowly, and her eyes came to life. It seems to me they's hills, she said. Of course, I don't know, but it seems to me I heard they's hills and even mountains, big ones. Grandma drew a long, whining sigh in her sleep. Al said, we'll burn right up if we got climbing to do. Have to throw out some of this stuff. Maybe we shouldn't have brought that preacher. You'll be glad of that preacher, for we're through, said Ma. That preacher will help us. She looked ahead at the gleaming road again. Al steered with one hand and put the other on the vibrating gear-shift lever. He had difficulty in speaking. His mouth formed the words silently before he said them aloud. Ma, she looked slowly around at him, her head swaying a little with the car's motion. Ma, you scared of going? You scared of going to a new place? Her eyes grew thoughtful and soft. A little, she said. Only it ain't like scared so much. I'm just a-sitting here waiting. When something happens that I got to do something, I'll do it. Ain't you thinking what's it gonna be like when we get there? Ain't you scared of it won't be nice like we thought? No, she said quickly. No, I ain't. You can't do that. I can't do that. It's too much. Living too many lives. Up ahead, there's 1,000 lives we might live, but when it comes, it'll only be one. If I go ahead on all of them, it's too much. You gotta live ahead, 'cause you're so young. But it's just the road going by for me, and that's how. And it's just how soon they're gonna wanna eat some more pork bones. Her face tightened. That's all I can do. I can't do no more. All the rest you'd get upset if I did any more than that. They'd depend on me just thinking about that. Grandma yawned shrilly and opened her eyes. She looked around wildly. I gotta get out. Praise God, she said. First clump a brush, said Al. There's one up ahead. Brush or no brush, I gotta get out, I tell you. And she began to whine. I gotta get out. I gotta get out. Al speeded up, and when he came to the low brush, he pulled up short. Ma threw the door open and half pulled the struggling old lady out beside the road and into the bushes, and Ma held her so Grandma would not fall when she squatted. On top of the truck, the others stirred to life, their faces shining with sunburn they could not escape. Tom and Casey and Noah and Uncle John let themselves wearily down. Ruthie and Winfield swarmed down the sideboards and went off into the bushes. Connie helped Rosa Sharon down gently. Under the canvas, Grandpa was awake, his head sticking out, but his eyes were drugged and watery, and still senseless. He watched the others, but there was little recognition in his watching. Tom called to him, Want to come down, Grandpa? The old eyes turned listlessly to him. No, said Grandpa. For a moment, the fierceness came into his eyes. I ain't a-going, I tell you. Gonna stay like Mully. And then he lost interest again. Ma came back, helping Grandma back up the bank to the highway. Tom, she said, get that pan of bones under the canvas in the back. We gotta eat some. Tom got the pan and passed it around, and the family stood by the roadside, gnawing the crisp particles from the pork bones. Sure lucky we bring these along, said Pa. Get so stiff up there, can't hardly move. Where's the water? Ain't it with you, Ma asked. I set out that gallon jug. Pa climbed the sides and looked under the canvas. It ain't here. We must have forgot it. Thirst set in instantly. Winfield moaned. I want a drink. I want a drink. The men licked their lips, suddenly conscious of their thirst, and a little panic started. Al felt the fear growing. We'll get water first service station we come in. We need to get some gas too. The family swarmed up the truck sides. Ma helped Grandma get in and got in beside her. Al started the motor and they moved on. Castle to Payton, 25 miles, and the sun passed the zenith and started down. And the radiator cap began to jiggle up and down, and steam started to wish out. Near Payton there was a shack beside the road, and 2 gas pumps in front of it, and beside a fence a water faucet and a hose. Al drove in and nosed the Hudson up to the hose. As they pulled in, a stout man, red of face and arms, got up from a chair behind the gas pump and moved towards them. He wore brown corduroys and suspenders and a polo shirt, and he had a cardboard sun helmet painted silver on his head. The sweat beaded on his nose and under his eyes, and formed streams in the wrinkles of his neck. He strolled towards the truck, looking truculent and stern. You folks aiming to buy anything? Gasoline or stuff? Al was out already, unscrewing the steaming radiator cap with the tips of his fingers, jerking his hand away to escape the spurt when the cap should come loose. Need some gas, mister. Got any money? Sure, think we're begging? The truculence left the fat man's face. Well, that's all right, folks. Help yourself to water, he hastened to explain. Road is full of people come in and use water, dirty up the toilet, and then, by God, they steal stuff and don't buy nothing. Got no money to buy with. Come begging a gallon gas to move on. Tom dropped angrily to the ground and moved towards the fat man. We're paying our way, he said fiercely. You got no call to give us a going over. We ain't asked you for nothing. I ain't, the fat man said quickly. The sweat began to soak through his short-sleeved polo shirt. Just help yourself to water and go use the toilet if you want. Winfield had got the hose. He drank from the end and then turned the stream over his head and face and emerged dripping. It ain't cool, he said. I don't know what the country's coming to, the fat man continued. His complaint had shifted now, and he was no longer talking to or about the Joes. 56 cars of folks going by every day. Folks all moving west with kids and household stuff. Where they going? What they're going to do? Doing the same as us, said Tom. Going someplace to live, trying to get along, that's all. Well, I don't know what the country's coming to. I just don't know. Here's me trying to get along, too. Think any of them big news cars stop here? No, sir. They go on them yellow-painted company stations in town. They don't stop no place like this. Most folks stop us here ain't got nothing. Al flipped the radiator cap and it jumped into the air with a head of steam behind it, and a hollow bubbling sound came out of the radiator. On top of the truck, the suffering hound dog crawled timidly to the edge of the load and looked over, whimpering, towards the water. Uncle John climbed up and lifted him down by the scruff of the neck. For a moment the dog staggered on stiff legs, and then he went to lap the mud under the faucet. In the highway the cars whizzed by, glistening in the heat, and the hot wind of their going fanned into the servants' station yard. Al filled the radiator with the hose. It ain't that I'm trying to get trade out of rich folks, the fat man went on. I'm just trying to get trade. Why, the folks that stops here begs gasoline, and they trades for gasoline. I can show you in my back room the stuff they'll trade for gas and oil, beds and baby buggies and pots and pans. One family traded a doll their kid had for a gallon, and what am I gonna do with this stuff? Open a junk shop? Why, one fellow wanted to give me his shoes for a gallon. And if I was that kind of fella, I bet I could get. He glanced at Ma and stopped. Jim Casey had wet his neck, and the drops still coursed down his high forehead, and his muscled neck was wet, and his shirt was wet. He moved over beside Tom. "It ain't the people's fault," he said. "How'd you like to sell the bed you sleep on for a tankful of gas?" "I know it ain't their fault. Every person I talk to is on the move for a damn good reason. But what's the country coming to? That's what I want to know. What's it coming to? Fella can't make a living no more. Folks can't make a living farming. I ask you, what's it coming to? I can't figure it out. Everybody I ask, they can't figure it out. Fella wants to trade his shoes so he can get 100 miles on. I can't figure it out." He took off his silver hat and wiped his forehead with his palm. When Tom took off his cap and wiped his forehead with it, he went to the hose and wet the cap through and squeezed it and put it on again. Ma worked a tin cup out through the side bars of the truck, and she took water to Grandma and to Grandpa on top of the load. She stood on the bars and handed the cup to Grandpa, and he wet his lips, and then shook his head and refused once more. The old eyes looked up at Ma in pain and bewilderment for a moment before the awareness receded again. Al started the motor and backed the truck to the gas pump. "Fill her up. She'll take about 7, said Al. "We'll give her 6 so she don't spill none." The fat man put the hose to the tank. "No, sir. I just don't know what the country's coming to. Relief and all." Casey said, "I've been walking around this country. Everybody asking that. What are we coming to? Seems to me we don't never come to nothing. Always on the way. Always going and going. Why don't folks think about that? That's moving now. People moving. We know why and we know how. Moving 'cause they got to. That's why folks always move. Moving 'cause they want something better than what they got. And that's the only way they'll ever get. Wanting and needing it. They'll go out and get it. It's being hurt that makes folks mad to fighting. I've been walking around this country and hearing folks talk like you." The fat man pumped the gasoline, and the needle turned on the pump dial, recording the amount. "Yeah, but what's it coming to? That's what I want to know." Tom broke in irritably. "Well, you ain't never gonna know. Casey tries to tell you, and you just ask the same thing over. I seen fellas like you before. You ain't asking nothing. You're just singing a kind of song. What we coming to? You don't want to know. Country's moving around, going places. They's folks dying all around. Maybe you'll die pretty soon, but you won't know nothing. I seen too many folks like you. You don't want to know nothing. Just sing yourself to sleep with a song. What we coming to?" He looked at the gas pump, rusted and old, and at the shack behind it, built of old lumber, the nail holes of its first use still showing through the paint that had been the brave yellow paint that had tried to imitate the big company stations in town. But the paint couldn't cover the old nail holes and the old cracks in the lumber, and the paint could not be renewed. The imitation was a failure, and the owner had known it was a failure. Inside the open door of the shack, Tom saw the oil barrels, only 2 of them, and a candy counter with stale candies and licorice whips turning brown with age, and cigarettes. He saw the broken chair and the fly screen with a rusted hole, and the littered yard that should have been gravelled, and behind, the cornfield drying and dying in the sun. Behind the house, and the little stock of used tires and retreaded tires, and he saw for the first time the fat man's cheap wash pants, and his cheap polo shirt, and his paper hat. He said, "I didn't mean to sound off at you, mister. It's the heat. You ain't got nothing. Pretty soon you'll be on the road yourself, and it ain't tractors it'll put you there. It's them pretty yellow stations in town. Folks is moving," he said ashamedly. "And you'll be moving, mister." The fat man slowed on the pump and stopped while Tom spoke. He looked worriedly at Tom. "How do you know?" he asked helplessly. "How'd you know we was already talking about packing up and moving west?" Casey answered him. "It's everybody," he said. "Here's me that used to give all my fight against the devil, 'cause I figured the devil was the enemy. But they's something worse than the devil that's got a hold of the country, and it ain't gonna let go till it's chopped loose. Ever see one of them Gila monsters take hold, mister? Grabs hold and you chop him in two, and his head hangs on. Chop him at the neck and his head hangs on. Gotta take a screwdriver and pry his head apart to get him loose, and while he's laying there, poison is drippin' and drippin' into the hole he's made with his teeth." He stopped and looked sideways at Tom. The fat man stared hopelessly straight ahead. His hand started turning the crank slowly. "I don't know what we're coming to," he said softly. Over by the water hose, Connie and Rosa Sharon stood together, talking secretly. Connie washed the tin cup and felt the water with his finger before he filled the cup again. Rosa Sharon watched the cars go by on the highway. Connie held out the cup to her. "This water ain't cool, but it's wet," he said. She looked at him and smiled secretly. She was all secrets now. She was pregnant. Secrets and little silences that seemed to have meanings. She was pleased with herself, and she complained about things that didn't really matter. She demanded services of Connie that were silly, and both of them knew they were silly. Connie was pleased with her too, filled with wonder that she was pregnant. He liked to think that he was in on the secrets she had. When she smiled slyly, he smiled slyly too, and they exchanged confidences and whispers. The world had drawn close around them, and they were in the center of it. Or rather, Rosa Sharon was in the center of it, and Connie making a small orbit around her. Everything they said was a kind of secret. She drew her eyes from the highway. "I ain't very thirsty," she said daintily, "but I maybe ought to drink." And he nodded, for he knew well what she meant. She took another cup and rinsed her mouth, and spat, and then drank a cupful of tepid water. "Want another?" he asked. "Just a half," and so he filled the cup just half and gave it to her. A Lincoln Zephyr, silvery and low, whisked by. She turned to see where the others were and saw them clustered about the truck. Reassured, she said, "How'd you like to be going along in that?" Connie sighed. "Maybe, after." They both knew what he meant. "And if they's plenty of work in California, we'll get our own car. But them," he indicated the disappearing Zephyr, "them cost as much as a good-sized house. I'd rather have a house." "I like it to have the house and one of them," she said, "but course the house would be first because—" and they both knew what she meant. They were terribly excited about the pregnancy. "You feel all right?" he asked. "Tired, just tired riding in the sun. We got to do that, or we won't never get to California." "I know," she said. The dog wandered, sniffing, past the truck, trotted into the puddle under the hose again, and lapped at the muddy water. And then he moved away, nose down and ears hanging. He sniffed with his way among the dusty weeds beside the road to the edge of the pavement. He raised his head and looked across and started over. Rosa Sharon screamed shrilly. A big swift car whisked near. Tires squealed. The dog dodged helplessly, and with a shriek cut off in the middle, went under the wheels. The big car slowed for a moment, and the faces looked back, and then it gathered greater speed and disappeared. And the dog, a blot of blood and tangled, burst intestine, kicked slowly in the road. Rosa Sharon's eyes were wide. "Do you think it'll hurt?" she begged. "Think it'll hurt?" Connie put his arm around her. "Come, sit down," he said. "It wasn't nothing. But I felt it hurt. I felt it kind of jar when I yelled. Come, sit down. It wasn't nothing. It won't hurt." He led her to the side of the truck, away from the dying dog, and sat her down on the running board. Tom and Uncle John walked out to the mess. The last quiver was going out of the crushed body. Tom took it by the legs and dragged it to the side of the road. Uncle John looked embarrassed, as though it were his fault. "I ought to tie him up," he said. Pa looked down at the dog for a moment, and then he turned away. "Let's get out of here," he said. "I don't know how we was going to feed him anyway. Just as well, maybe." The fat man came from behind the truck. "I'm sorry, folks," he said. "A dog just don't last no time near a highway. I had 3 dogs run over in a year. Don't keep none no more." And he said, "Don't you folks worry none about it. I'll take care of him, bury him out in the cornfield." Ma walked over to Rosa Sharon where she sat, still shuddering, on the running board. "You all right, Rosa Sharon?" she asked. You feeling poorly?" "I seen that. Give me a start." "I heard you yip," said Ma. "Get yourself laced up now." "You suppose it might 'a' hurt?" "No," said Ma. "If you go on greasing yourself and feeling sorry and tucking yourself in a swallow's nest, it might. Rise up now and help me get Grandma comfortable. Forget that baby for a minute. He'll take care of himself." "Where's Grandma?" Rosa Sharon asked. "I don't know. She's somewhere. She's around here somewheres. maybe in the outhouse. The girl went towards the toilet. In a moment, she came out, helping Grandma along. She went to sleep in there, said Rose Sharon. Grandma grinned. It's nice in there, she said. They got a good patent toilet in there, and the water comes down. I like it in there, she said contentedly. Would have took a good nap if I wasn't woken up. It ain't a nice place to sleep, said Rose Sharon as she helped Grandma into the car. Grandma settled herself happily. Maybe it ain't nice for Purdy, but it's nice for nice, she said. Tom said, let's go. We gotta make miles. Pa whistled shrilly. Now where'd them kids go? He whistled again, putting his fingers to his mouth. In a moment, they broke from the cornfield, Ruthie ahead and Winfield trailing her. Eggs, Ruthie cried. Look, a dozen soft, grayish white eggs were in her grubby hands. And as she held up her hand, her eyes fell upon the dead dog beside the road. Oh, she said. Ruthie and Winfield walked slowly towards the dog. They inspected him. Pa called to them, come on, you, lest you want to get left. They turned sullenly and walked to the truck. Ruthie looked once more at the gray reptile eggs in her hand, and then she threw them away. They climbed up the side of the truck. His eyes were still open, said Ruthie in a hushed tone, but Winfield gloried the scene. He said boldly, his guts was just strode all over. He was silent for a moment. Strode all over, he said, and then he rolled over quickly and vomited down the side of the truck. When he sat up again, his eyes were watery and his nose running. It ain't like killing pigs, he said in explanation. Al had the hood of the Hudson up, and he checked the oil level. He brought a gallon can from the floor of the front seat and poured a quantity of cheap black oil into the pipe and checked the level again. Tom came beside him. Want I should take her a piece, he said. I ain't tired, said Al. Well, you didn't get no sleep last night. I took a snooze this morning. Get up there on top. I'll take her. All right, Al said reluctantly. Watch the oil gauge pretty close. Take her slow. And I've been watching for a short. Take a look at the needle now and then. If she jumps to discharge, it's a short. And take her slow, Tom. She's overloaded. Tom laughed. I'll watch her, he said. You can rest easy. The family piled on top of the truck again. Ma settled herself beside Grandma in the seat, and Tom took his place and started the motor. Sure is loose, he said, and he put it in gear and pulled away down the highway. The motor droned along steadily, and the sun receded down the sky in front of them. Grandma slept steadily, and even Ma dropped her head forward and dozed. Tom pulled his cap over his eyes and shut out the blinding sun. Payton to Meeker is 13 miles, Meeker to Harrah is 14 miles, and then Oklahoma, the big city. Tom drove straight on. Ma waked and looked at the streets as they went through the city, and the family, on top of the truck, stared about at the stores, at the big houses, at the office buildings. And then the buildings grew smaller and the stores smaller, the wrecking yards and the hot dog stands, the out-city dance halls. Ruthie and Winfield saw it all, and it embarrassed them with its bigness and its strangeness, and it frightened them with the fine-clothed people they saw. They did not speak of it to each other. Later they would, but not now. They saw the oil derricks in the town and on the edge of town, oil derricks black, and the smell of oil and gas in the air. But they didn't exclaim. It was so big and so strange it frightened them. In the street, Rose Sharon saw a man in a light suit. He wore white shoes and a flat straw hat. She touched Connie and indicated the man with her eyes, and then Connie and Rose Sharon giggled softly to themselves, and the giggles got the best of Connie and of them. They covered their mouths, and it felt so good that they looked for other people to giggle at. Ruthie and Winfield saw them giggling, and it looked such fun that they tried to do it too, but they couldn't. The giggles wouldn't come. But Connie and Rose Sharon were breathless and red with stifling laughter before they could stop. It got so bad that they only had to look at each other to start over again. The outskirts were widespread. Tom drove slowly and carefully in the traffic, and then they were on 66, the Great Western Road, and the sun was sinking on the line of the road. The windshield was bright with dust. Tom pulled his cap lower over his eyes, so low that he had to tilt his head back to see it out at all. Grandma slept on. The sun on her closed eyelids and the veins on her temples were blue, and the little bright veins on her cheeks were wine-colored, and the old brown marks on her face turned darker. Tom said, "We stay on this road right straight through." Ma had been silent for a long time. "Maybe we better find a place to stop for sunset," she said. "I gotta get some pork boiling and some bread made. That takes time." "Sure," Tom agreed. "We ain't gonna make this trip in one jump. Might as well stretch ourselves. Oklahoma to Bethany is 14 miles. Tom said, "I think we better stop before the sun goes down. I've got to build that thing on the top. The sun killed the folks up there." Ma had been dozing again. Her head jerked upright. "Gotta get some supper cooking," she said. And she said, "Tom, your pa told me about you crossing the state line." He was a long time answering. "Yeah, what about it, Ma?" "Well, I'm scared about it. It'll make you kind of running away. Maybe they'll catch you." Tom held his hand over his eyes to protect himself from the lowering sun. "Don't you worry," he said. "I figured her out. There's lots of fellas out on parole, and they's going in all the time. If I get caught for anything else out west, well, then they got my picture and my prints in Washington. They'll send me back. But if I don't do no crimes, they won't give a damn." "Well, I'm scared about it. Sometimes you do a crime and you don't even know it's bad. Maybe they got crimes in California we don't know about. Maybe you're gonna do something and it's alright, and in California it ain't alright." "Be just the same if I wasn't on parole," he said. "Only if I get caught I get a bigger jolting than other folks." "Now you coulda worried," he said. We got plenty to worry about without you figuring out things to worry about." "I can't help it," she said. "Minute you cross the line, you done a crime." "Well, that's better than sticking around south and starving to death," he said. "We better look out for a place to stop." They went through Bethany and out on the other side in a ditch where a culvert went under the road. An old touring car was pulled off the highway, and a little tent was pitched beside it, and smoke came out of a stovepipe through the tent. Tom pointed ahead. "There's some folks camping. Looks like as good a place as we seen." He slowed his motor and pulled up to a stop beside the road. The hood of the old touring car was up, and a middle-aged man stood looking down at the motor. He wore a cheap straw sombrero, a blue shirt, and a black spotted vest, and his jeans were stiff and shiny with dirt. His face was lean, the deep cheek lines great furrows down his face, so that his cheekbones and chin stood out sharply. He looked up at the Joe truck, and his eyes were puzzled and angry. Tom leaned out the window. "Any law against folks stopping here for the night?" The man had seen only the truck. His eyes focused on Tom. "I don't know," he said. "We only stopped here because we couldn't get no further." "Any water here?" The man pointed to a service station shack about a quarter-mile ahead. "There's water there. They'll let you take a bucket of." "Well, you suppose we could camp down alongside?" The lean man looked puzzled. "We don't own it," he said. "We only stopped here because this goddamn old chap won't go no further." Tom insisted, "Anyways, you're here and we ain't. You got a right to stay if you want, neighbors or not." The appeal to hospitality had an instant effect. The lean face broke into a smile. "Why, sure, come on off the road. Proud to have you." And he called, "Sari, there's some folks gonna stay with us. Come out and say how do you do." "Sari ain't well," he added. The tent flaps opened and a wizened woman came out, a face wrinkled as a dried leaf, and her eyes seemed to flame in her face, black eyes that seemed to look out of a well of horror. She was small and shuddering. She held herself upright by a tent flap, and the hand holding onto the canvas was a skeleton covered with wrinkled skin. When she spoke, her voice had a beautiful low timbre, soft and modulated, and yet with ringing overtones. "Tell 'em welcome," she said. "Tell 'em good and welcome." Tom drove off the road and brought his truck into the field and lined it up with the touring car, and people boiled down from the truck. Ruthie and Winfield too quickly, so that their legs gave way, and they shrieked at the pins and needles that ran through their limbs. Ma went quickly to work. She untied the 3-gallon bucket from the back of the truck and approached the squealing children. "Now you go and get water, right down there. Ask nice. Say, 'Please, can we get a bucket of water?' And say, 'Thank you.' And carry it back together, helping, and don't spill none. and if you see a stick of wood to burn, bring it on." The children stamped away toward the shack. By the tent, a little embarrassment had set in, and social intercourse had paused before it started. Pa said, "You ain't Oklahoma folks?" And Al, who stood near the car, looked at the license plate. "Kansas," he said. Lean Man said, "Galena, or right about there. Wilson, Ivy Wilson." "We're Jodes," said Papa. "We come from right near Southsaw." "Well, we're proud to meet you folks," said Ivy Wilson. "Sari, these is the Jodes." "I knowed you wasn't Oklahoma folks. You talk queer, kinda. That ain't no blame, you understand. Everybody says words different," said Ivy. "Arkansas folks says 'em different, and Oklahoma folks says 'em different. And we seen a lady from Massachusetts, and she said 'em differentest of all. Couldn't hardly make out what she was saying." Noah and Uncle John and the preacher began to unload the truck. They helped Grandpa down and sat him on the ground, and he sat limply, staring ahead of him. "You sick, Grandpa?" Noah asked. "You goddamn right," said Grandpa weakly. "Sicker than hell." Sari Wilson walked slowly and carefully toward him. "How'd you like to come in our tent?" she asked. "You can lay down on our mattress and rest." He looked up at her, drawn by her soft voice. "Come on now, you get some rest. We'll help you over." Without warning, Grandpa began to cry. His chin wavered, and his old lips tightened over his mouth, and he sobbed hoarsely. Ma rushed over to him and put her arms around him. She lifted him to his feet, her broad back straining, and she half lifted, half helped him into the tent. Uncle John said, "He must be good and sick. He ain't never done that before. Never seen him blubbering in my life." He jumped up on the truck and tossed a mattress down. Ma came out of the tent and went to Casey. "You've been around sick people," she said. "Grandpa's sick. Won't you go take a look at him?" Casey walked quickly to the tent and went inside. A double mattress was on the ground, the blankets spread neatly, and a little tin stove stood on the iron legs, and the fire in it burned unevenly. A bucket of water, a wooden box of supplies, and a box for a table. That was all. The light of the setting sun came pinkly through the tent walls. Sari Wilson knelt on the ground beside the mattress, and Grandpa lay on his back. His eyes were open, staring upward, and his cheeks were flushed. He breathed heavily. Casey took the skinny old wrist in his fingers. "Feeling kind of tired, Grandpa?" he asked. The staring eyes moved toward his voice, but did not find him. The lips practiced a speech, but did not speak it. Casey felt the pulse, and he dropped the wrist and put his hand over Grandpa's forehead. A struggle began in the old man's body. His legs moved restlessly, and his hands stirred. He said a whole string of blurred sounds that were not words, and his face was red under the spiky white whiskers. Sari Wilson spoke softly to Casey. "Know what's wrong?" He looked up at the wrinkled face and the burning eyes. "Do you?" "I think so." "What?" "Might be wrong. I wouldn't like to say." Casey looked back at the twitching red face. "Would you say maybe he's working up a stroke?" "I'd say that," said Sari. "I've seen it 3 times before." From outside came the sounds of camp making, wood chopping, and the rattle of pans. Ma looked through the flaps. "Grandma wants to come in. Would she better?" "She'll just fret if she don't." "Think he's all right?" Casey shook his head slowly. Ma looked quickly down at the struggling old face, with blood pounding through it. She drew outside, and her voice came through. "He's all right, Grandma. He's just taking a little rest." And Grandma answered silkily, "Well, I want to see him. He's a tricky devil. He will never let you know." And she came scurrying through the flaps. She stood over the mattress and looked down. "And what's the matter with you?" she demanded of Grandpa. And again his eyes reached toward her voice, and his lips writhed. "He's sulking," said Grandma. "I told you he was tricky. He's going to sneak away this morning so you wouldn't have to come." "And then his hips got hurting," she said disgustedly. "He's just sulking. I seen him when he wouldn't talk to nobody before." Casey said gently, "He ain't sulking, Grandma. He's sick." "Oh," she looked down at the old man again. "Sick bad, you think?" "Pretty bad, Grandma." For a moment she hesitated uncertainly. "Well," she said quickly, "why ain't you praying? You're a preacher, ain't you?" Casey's strong fingers blundered over to Grandpa's wrist and clasped around it. "I told you, Grandma, I ain't a preacher no more." "Pray anyway," she ordered. "You know all the stuff by heart." "I can't," said Casey. "I don't know what to pray for or who to pray to." Grandma's eyes wandered away and came to rest on Sari. "He won't pray," she said. "Did I ever tell you how Ruthie prayed when she was a little Skinner? Says, 'Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep.' And when she got there, the cupboard was bare. And so the poor dog got none. Amen. That's just what she done." The shadow of someone walking between the tent and the sun crossed the canvas. Grandpa seemed to be struggling. All his muscles twitched, and suddenly he jarred as though under a heavy blow. He lay still, and his breath was stopped. Casey looked down at the old man's face, and he saw that it was turning a blackish purple. Sari touched Casey's shoulders. She whispered, "His tongue, his tongue, his tongue." Casey nodded. Get in front of the Grandma." He pried the tight jaws apart and reached into the old man's throat for the tongue. And as he lifted it clear, a rattling breath came out, and a sobbing breath was indrawn. Casey found a stick on the ground and held down the tongue with it, and the uneven breath rattled in and out. Grandma hopped about like a chicken. "Pray," she said. "Pray, you. Pray, I tell you." Sari tried to hold her back. "Pray, goddamn you," Grandma cried. Casey looked up at her for a moment. The rasping breath came louder, more unevenly. "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." "Glory!" shouted Grandma. "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." "Amen." Long gasping a sigh came from the open mouth, and then a crying release of air. "Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us." The breathing had stopped. Casey looked down into Grandpa's eyes, and they were clear and deep and penetrating, and there was knowing, serene look in them. "Hallelujah," said Grandma. "Go on." "Amen," said Casey. Grandma was still then, and outside the tent all the noise had stopped. A car whished by on the highway. Casey still knelt on the floor beside the mattress. The people outside were listening, standing quietly, intent on the sounds of dying. Sari took Grandma by the arm, led her outside, and Grandma moved with dignity and held her head high. She walked for the family and held her head straight for the family. Sari took her to a mattress lying on the ground and sat her down, and Grandma looked straight ahead proudly, for she was on a show now. The tent was still, and at last Casey spread the tent flaps with his hands and stepped out. Pa asked, "What was it?" "Stroke," said Casey. "A good quick stroke." Life began to move again. The sun touched the horizon and flattened over it, and along the highway there came a long line of huge freight trucks with red sides. They rumbled along, pulling a little earthquake in the ground, and the standing exhaust pipes sputtered blue smoke from the diesel oil. One man drove each truck, and his relief man slept in a bunk high up against the ceiling. But the trucks never stopped, and they thundered day and night, and the ground shook under their heavy march. The family became a unit. Pa squatted down in the ground, and Uncle John beside him. Pa was head of the family now. Ma stood behind him. Noah and Tom and Al squatted, and the preacher sat down, and then reclined on his elbow. Connie and Rose and Sharon walked at a distance. Now Ruthie and Winfield, clattering up with a bucket of water held between them, felt the change, and they slowed up and set down the bucket and moved quietly to stand with Ma. Grandma sat proudly, coldly, until the group was formed, until no one looked at her, and then she lay down and covered her face with her arm. The red sun set and left a shining twilight on the land, so that the faces were bright in the evening, and the eyes shone in the reflection of the sky. The evening picked up light where it could. Pa said, "It was in Mr. Wilson's tent." Uncle John said, "He loaned his tent." "Fine, friendly folks," Pa said softly. Wilson stood by his broken car, and Sari had gone to the mattress to sit beside Grandma, but Sari was careful not to touch her. Pa called, "Mr. Wilson." The man scuffed near and squatted down, and Sari came and stood beside him. Pa said, "We're thankful to you folks." "We're proud to help," said Wilson. "We're beholden to you," said Pa. "There's no beholden in a time of dying," said Wilson, and Sari echoed him. "Never no beholden." Al said, "I'll fix your car. Me and Tom will." And Al looked proud that he could return the family's obligation. "We could use some help," Wilson admitted the retiring of the obligation. Pa said, "We gotta figure what to do. There's lots. You gotta report death, and when you do that, they either take $40 for the undertaker, or they take him for a pauper." Uncle John broke in, "We never did have no paupers." Tom said, maybe we got to learn. We never got booted off no land before, neither." "We done it clean," said Pa. "There can't be no blame be laid on us. We never took nothing we couldn't pay. We never suffered no man's charity. When Tom here got in trouble, we could hold up our heads. He only done what any man would have done." "Then what'll we do?" Uncle John asked. "We go in like the law says, and they'll come out for him. We only got $150. They take 40 to bury Grandpa, and we won't get to California, or else they'll bury him a pauper." The men stirred restively, and they studied the darkening ground in front of their knees. Pa said softly, "Grandpa buried his pa with his own hand, done it in dignity, and shaped the grave nice with his own shovel. There was a time when a man had the right to be buried by his own son, and a son had the right to bury his own father. The law is different now," said Uncle John. "Sometimes the law can't be followed no way," said Pa. "Not in decency, anyway. There's lots of times you can't. When Floyd was loose and going wild, the law said we got to give him up, and nobody give him up. Sometimes a fella gotta sift the law. I'm saying now I got the right to bury my own pa. Anybody got something to say?" The preacher rose high on his elbows. "Laws change," he said, "but gots to go on. You got the right to do what you gotta do." Pa turned to Uncle John. "It's your right too, John. You got any word against?" "No word against," said Uncle John. "Only it's like hiding him in the night. Grandpa's way was to come out a shooting," Pa said ashamedly. "We can't do like Grandpa done. We gotta get to California before our money gives out." Tom broke in. "Sometimes fellows working dig up a man, and they'll raise hell and figure he'd been killed. The government's got more interest in a dead man than a live one. They'll go to hell scraping trying to find out who he was and how he died. I offer we put a note of writing in a bottle and lay it with Grandpa, telling who he is and how he died and why he's buried here." Pa nodded in agreement. "That's good. Wrote out in a nice hand. But be not so lonesome, too, knowing his name is there with him. Not just an old fella, lonesome underground. And any more stuff to say?" "That's good. Wrote out in a nice hand. Be not so lonesome, too, knowing his name is there with him. Not just an old fellow lonesome underground. Any more stuff to say?" The circle was silent. Pa turned his head to Ma. "You lay him out?" "I'll lay him out," said Ma. "But who's to get supper?" Sari Wilson said, "I'll get supper. You go right ahead. Me and that big girl of yourn." "We sure thank you," said Ma. "Noah, get into them kegs and bring out some nice pork. Salt won't be deep in it yet, but it'll be right nice eatin'." "We got a half sack of potatoes," said Sari. Ma said, "Give me $2 half." Pa dug in his pocket and gave her the silver. She found the basin, filled it with water, and went to the tent. It was nearly dark in there. Sari came in and lighted a candle and stuck it upright on a box, and then she went out. For a moment, Ma looked down at the dead old man, and then in pity, she tore out a strip from her own apron and tied up his jaw. She straightened his limbs, folded his hands over his chest. She held his eyelids down and laid a silver piece on each one. She buttoned his shirt and washed his face. Sari looked in, saying, "Can I give you any help?" Ma looked slowly up. "Come in," she said. "I'd like to talk to you." "That was a good big girl you got," said Sari. "She is right in peeling potatoes." What can I do to help?" "I was gonna wash Grandpa all over," said Ma, "but he got no other clothes to put on. And, course, your quilt's spoilt. Can't never get the smell of death from a quilt. I seen a dog growl and shake at a mattress my Ma died on, and that was 2 years later. We'll drop him in your quilt. We'll make it up for you. We got a quilt for you." Sari said, "You shouldn't talk like that. We're proud to help. I ain't felt so safe in a long time. People needs to help." Ma nodded. "They do," she said. She looked long at the old whiskery face with its bound jaw and silver eyes shining in the candlelight. "He ain't gonna look natural. We'll wrap him up." The old lady took it good. "Why, she's old," said Ma. "Maybe she don't even rightly know what happened. Maybe she won't really know for quite a while. Besides, us folks takes a pride in holding it. My pa used to say, anybody can break down. It takes a man not to. We always try to hold it in." She folded the quilt neatly about Grandpa's legs and around his shoulders. She brought the corner of the quilt over his head like a cowl and pulled it down over his face. Sari handed her a half-dozen big safety pins, and she pinned the quilt neatly and tightly about the long package. And at last she stood up. "It won't be bad, Beering," she said. "We got a preacher to see him in, and his folks is all around." Suddenly she swayed a little, and Sari went to her and steadied her. "It's sleep," Ma said in a shamed tone. "No, I'm all right. We've been so busy getting ready, you see." "Come in the air," Sari said. "Yeah, I'm all done here." Sari blew out the candle, and the two went out. A bright fire burned in the bottom of the little gulch, and Tom, with sticks and wire, had made supports from which two kettles hung and bubbled fiercely, and good steam poured out under the lids. Rosa Sharon knelt on the ground out of range of the burning heat, and she had a long spoon in her hand. She saw Ma come out of the tent, and she stood up and went to her. "Ma," she said, "I gotta ask." "Scared again?" Ma said. "Why, you can't get through 9 months without sorrow." "But will it hurt the baby?" Ma said. "There used to be a saying, a child born out of sorrow will be a happy child. Isn't that so, Miss Wilson?" "I heard it like that," said Sari, "and I heard the other, born out of too much joy, it'll be a doleful boy." "I'm all jumpy inside," said Sharon. "Well, we ain't none of us jumping for fun. You just keep watching the pots." On the edge of the ring of firelight the men had gathered 4 tools. They had a shovel and a mattock. Pa marked the ground 8 feet long and 3 feet wide. The work went on in relays. Pa chopped the earth with the mattock, and then Uncle John shoveled it out. Al chopped and Tom shoveled. Noah chopped and Connie shoveled, and the whole drove down, for the work never diminished in speed. The shovels of dirt flew out the hole in quick spurts, and when Tom was shoulder deep in the rectangular pit, he said, "How deep, Pa?" "Good and deep. A couple more feet more. You get out now, Tom, and get that paper rope." Tom boosted himself out the hole, and Noah took his place. Tom went to Ma, where she tended the fire. "We got any paper and pen, Ma?" Ma shook her head slowly. "No, that's one thing we didn't bring." She looked towards Sari, and the little woman walked out quickly to her tent. She brought back a Bible and a half pencil. "Here, there's a clear page in front. Use that and tear it out." She handed the book and pencil to Tom. Tom sat down in the firelight. He squinted his eyes in concentration, and at last wrote slowly and carefully on the end paper in big clear letters. "This here is William James Joad. Died of a stroke. Old man. His folks buried him because they got no money to pay for funerals. Nobody killed him. Just a stroke and he died." He stopped. "Ma, listen to this here." He read it slowly to her. "Why, that sounds nice," she said. "Can you stick something from the scripture so it'll be religious? Open up and get a saying something out of scripture?" "Gotta be short," said Tom. "I ain't got much room left on the page." Sari said, "How about God have mercy on his soul?" "No, it sounds too much like he was hung." "I'll copy some." He turned the pages and read, mumbling his lips, saying the words under his breath. "Here's a good short one. And Lot said unto him, Oh no, my lord." "Don't mean nothing," said Ma. "Long's you're gonna put one down, it might as well be something." Sarah said, "Turn to the Psalms over further. You can always get something out of the Psalms." Tom flipped the pages and looked down at the verses. "Now here is one," he said. "This here's a nice one, just flowed full of religion. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered." "How's that?" "That's real nice," said Ma. "Put that one in." Tom wrote carefully. Ma rinsed and wiped the fruit jar, and Tom screwed the lid down tight on it. "Maybe a preacher ought to wrote it," he said. Ma said, "No, the preacher wasn't no kin." She took the jar from him and went into the dark tent. She unpinned the covering and slipped the fruit jar under the thin, cold hands, and pinned the comforter tight again. And then she went back to the fire. The men came from the grave, their faces shining with perspiration. "All right," said Pa. He and John and Noah and Al went into the tent, and they came out carrying the long pinned bundle between them. They carried it to the grave. Pa leaped into a hole and received the bundle in his arm, and laid it down gently. Uncle John put out a hand and helped Pa out of the hole. Pa asked, "How about Grandma?" "I'll see." She walked to the mattress and looked down at the old woman for a second. Then she walked and went back to the grave. "Sleeping," she said. "Maybe she'd hold it against me, but I ain't gonna wake her up. She's tired." Pa said, "Where's that the preacher? We ought to have a prayer." Tom said, "I seen him walking down the road. He don't like to pray no more." "Don't like to pray?" "No, Ma," said Tom. "He ain't a preacher no more. He figures it ain't right to fool people, acting like a preacher when he ain't a preacher. I bet he went away so nobody would ask him." Casey had come quietly near, and he heard Tom speak. "I didn't run away," he said. "I'll help your folks, but I won't fool you." "Won't you," Pa said, "won't you say a few words? Ain't none of our folks ever been buried without a few words." "I'll say 'em," said the preacher. Connie led Rose Sharon to the graveside. She reluctant. "You gotta go," Connie said. "It ain't decent not to. It'll just be a little." The firelight fell on the group of people, showing their faces and their eyes, dwindling in their dark clothes. All the hats were off now. The light danced, streaking over the people. Casey said, "It'll be a short one." He bowed his head, and the others followed his lead. Casey said solemnly, "This here old man just lived a life and just died out of it. I don't know whether he was good or bad, but that don't matter much. He was alive, and that's what mattered. And now he's dead, and that don't matter. Heard a fella tell a poem one time, and he says, 'All that lives is holy.' Got to thinking, and pretty soon it means more than the words say. And I wouldn't pray for an old fella that's dead. He's all right. He got a job to do, but it's all laid out for him to do it, for him, and there's only one way to do it. But us, we got a job to do, and there's 1,000 ways, and we don't know which one to take. And if I was to pray, it'd be for the folks that don't know which way to turn. Grandpa here, he got the easy street. And now, cover him up and let's him get to his work." He raised his head. Pa said, "Amen," and the others muttered, "Amen." And then Pa took the shovel, half filled it with dirt, and spread gently into the black hole. He handed the shovel to Uncle John, and John dropped in a shovelful. Then the shovel went from hand to hand until every man had his turn. When all had taken their duty and their right, Pa attacked the mound of loose dirt and hurriedly filled the hole. The women moved back to the fire to see to supper. Ruthie and Winfield watched, observed. Ruthie said solemnly, "Grandpa's down under there," and Winfield looked at her with horrified eyes, and then he ran away to the fire and sat on the ground and sobbed to himself. Pa half filled the hole, and then he stood panting with effort while Uncle John finished it. And John was shaping up the mound when Tom stopped him. "Listen," Tom said. "If we leave a grave, they'll have to open it in no time. We gotta hide it. Level her off, and we'll strew dry grass. We gotta do that." Pa said, "I didn't think of that. It ain't right to leave a grave unmounded. Can't help it. They'll dig 'em right up, and we'd get it for breaking the law. You know what I get if I break the law." "Yeah, I forgot that," Pa said. He took the shovel from John and leveled the grave. "She'll sink come winter. Can't help that. We'll be a long ways off by winter. Tromp her in good, and we'll strew stuff over her." When the pork and the potatoes were done, the family sat about on the ground and ate, and they were quiet, staring into the fire. Wilson, tearing a slab of meat with his teeth, sighed with contentment. "Nice eating, pig," he said. "Well," Pa explained, "we had a couple shoats, and we thought we might as well eat them. Can't get nothing for 'em. When we get kinda used to moving, and Ma can set up her bread, why, it'll be pretty nice seeing road and 2 kegs of pork riding in the truck. How long you folks been on the road?" Wilson cleared his teeth with his tongue and swallowed. "We ain't been lucky. We've been 3 weeks from home." "Why, God Almighty, we aim to be California in 10 days or less." Al broke in. "I don't know, Pa, with that load we're packing, we maybe never gonna get there. Not if they's mountains to go over." They were silent about the fire. Their faces turned downward, and their hair and foreheads showed in the light. Above the little dome of the firelight, the summer stars shone thinly, and the heat of the day was gradually withdrawn. On her mattress, away from the fire, Grandma whimpered softly like a puppy. The heads of all turned in her direction. Ma said, "Rose Sharon, like a good girl, go lay with Grandma. She needs somebody now. She's knowing now." Rose Sharon got to her feet and walked to the mattress and lay beside the old woman, and the murmur of their soft voices drifted to the fire. Rose Sharon and Grandma whispered together on the mattress. Noah said, "Funny thing is, losing Grandpa ain't made me feel no different than I done before. I ain't no sadder than I was. It's just the same thing. Grandpa in the old place, they was just the same thing. It's a goddamn shame." Al said. He had been talking what he's gonna do, how he's gonna squeeze grapes over his head and then let the juice run in his whiskers and all stuff like that. Casey said he was fooling all the time. I think he knowed it. And Grandpa didn't die tonight. He died the minute you took him off the place. You sure of that? Why, no. Oh, he was breathing, Casey went on, but he was dead. He was that place, and he knowed it. Uncle John said, "Did you know he was a-dying?" "Yeah, I knowed it." John gazed at him, and a horror grew in his face. "And you didn't tell nobody?" "What good?" Casey asked. We might have done something." "What?" "I don't know, but no," Casey said. "You couldn't. Your will was fixed, and Grandpa didn't have no part in it. He didn't suffer none. Not after the first thing this morning. He just stayed with the land. He couldn't leave it." Uncle John sighed deeply. Wilson said, "We had to leave my brother a will." The heads turned towards him. Him and me had 40s side by side. He's older than me. Neither one ever drove a car. Well, we went in and we sold everything. Will, he bought a car, and they give him a kid to show him how to use it. So in the afternoon before we're going to start, Will and Aunt Minnie go practicing. Will, he comes back to a bend in the road and he yells, "Whoa," and yanks back. And he goes through a fence and yells, "Whoa, you bastard," and trumps down on the gas and goes over into a gulch. And there he was. Didn't have nothing more to sell and didn't have no car. But it were his own damn fault, praise God. He's so damn mad he won't come along with us. Just sit there a-cussin' and a-cussin'. What's he gonna do? I don't know. He's too mad to figure. And we couldn't wait. Only had $85 to go on. We couldn't set and cut it up, but we ate it up anyway. Didn't go 100 miles without when a tooth in the rear end bust, and cost $30 to get her fixed. And then we got to get a tire, and then a spark plug crackled, and Sari got sick. Had to stop for 10 days. And now the goddamn car is busted again, and the money's getting low. I don't know when we'll ever get to California. If only I could fix a car, but I don't know nothing about cars. Al asked importantly, "What's the matter?" "Well, she just won't run. Starts and farts and stops. In a minute she'll start again, and then before you can get her going, she peters out again. Runs a minute and then dies. Yes, sir. And I can't keep her going no matter how much gas I give her. It got worse and worse, and now I can't get her moving at all." Al was very proud and very mature. Then, "I think you got a plug gas line. I'll blow her out for you." And Pa was proud too. "He's a good hand with a car," Pa said. "Well, I'll sure thank you for your hand. I sure will. Makes a fellow feel kind kind of feel like a little kid when he can't fix nothing. When we get to California, I am to give me a nice car. Maybe she won't break down. Pa said, when we get there, getting there's the trouble. Oh, but she's worth it, said Wilson. Why, I seen handbills, how they need folks to pick fruit, and good wages. Why, I just think how it's gonna be under them shady trees, a pickin' fruit, and taking a bite every once in a while. Why, hell, they don't care how much you eat, 'cause they got so much. And with them good wages, maybe a fellow can get himself a little piece of land and work out for extra cash. Why, hell, in a couple years, I bet a fellow could have a place of his own. Pa said, we seen them handbills. I got one right here. He took out of his purse, and from it took a folded orange handbill. In black type it said, pea pickers wanted in California. Good wages, all season. 800 pickers wanted. Wilson looked at it curiously. Why, that's the one I seen. The very same. You suppose they might got all 100 already? Pa said, this is just one little part of California. Why, that's the second biggest state we got. Suppose they did get all of them 800. There's plenty places else. I'd rather pick fruit anyway. Like he says, under them trees of picking fruit. Why, even the kids like to do it. Suddenly Al got up and walked to the Wilson's touring car. He looked in it for a moment, and then he came back and sat down. You can't fix her tonight, Wilson said. I know. I'll get to her in the morning. Tom had watched his younger brother carefully. I was thinking something like that myself, he said. No, asked, what are you two fellows talking about? Tom and Al went silent, each waiting for the other. You tell him, Al said finally. Well, maybe it's no good, and maybe it ain't the same thing. Al's thinking, here she is anyways. We gotta overload, but Mr. and Mrs. Wayne and Wilson ain't. If some of us folks could ride with them and take their light stuff in the truck, we wouldn't break no springs, and we could get up the hills. And me and Al both knows about a car, so we could keep that car rolling. We'd keep together on the road, and it'd be good for everyone. Wilson jumped up. Why, sure. Why, we'd be proud. We certainly would. You hear that, Sari? It's a nice thing. Wouldn't be a burden on your folks? No, by God, said Pa. Wouldn't be no burden at all. You'd be helping us. Will settled back uneasily. Well, I don't know. What's the matter? Don't you wanna? Well, you see, I only got about $30 left, and I won't be no burden. Ma said, you won't be no burden. Each'll help each, and we'll all get to California. Sari Wilson helped lay Grandpa out, and she stopped. The relationship was plain. Al cried, that car'll take 6 easy. Say me to drive, and Rose, Sharon, Connie, and Grandma. Then we take the big light stuff and pile her on the truck, and we'll trade off ever so often. He spoke loudly, for a load of worry was lifted from him. They smiled shyly and looked down at the ground. Pa fingered the dusty earth with his fingertips. He said, Ma favors a white house with oranges growing around. There's a big picture on a calendar she's seen. Sari said, if I get sick again, you gotta go on and get there. We ain't a-going to be a burden. Ma looked carefully at Sari, and she seemed to see for the first time the pain-tormented eyes and the face that was haunted and shrinking with pain. And Ma said, we gonna see you get through. You said yourself, you can't let help go unwanted. She studied the wrinkled fingers in the firelight. We gotta get some sleep tonight, she stood up. Grandpa, it's like he's dead a year, Ma said. The families moved lazily to their sleep, yawning luxuriously. Ma slashed the tin plates off a little and rubbed the grease free with a flour sack. The fire died down, and the stars descended. Few passenger cars went by on the highway now, but the transport trucks thundered by at intervals and put little earthquakes in the ground. In the ditch, the cars were hardly visible under the starlight. A tied dog howled at the service station down the road. The families were quiet and sleeping, and the field mice grew bold and scampered about among the mattresses. Only Sari Wilson was awake. She stared into the sky, braced her body firmly against the pane.